Daryl Kimball still here at the Arms Control Association. We're going to pick up on some of the key issues that Congressman Garamendi opened our conference about just a few minutes ago. Our next panel will be moderated by Xiaodon Liang, who is our senior analyst focusing on nuclear weapons policy and disarmament. Xiaodon, over to you and our expert panel.
All right, thank you very much, Daryl. So yes, I'm Xiaodon Liang, Senior Policy Analyst at the ACA. I'm very delighted and honored to be here with everyone to moderate this panel, where we will be discussing today the question of how much is enough, and examine the looming decisions on US nuclear force size and spending. Now, before introducing our panelists, I'll give a few comments to set the table for our conversation. So Daryl provided earlier an overview of the international situation. Of course, I think the essentials are pretty simple. The two key points are the expiration of New START in 2026 and Russia's refusal to engage in talks on a follow-on. Second important calculation, of course, is China's nuclear buildup, which the US intelligence believes will probably lead to around 1,000 warheads by 2030. Now, the administration says, and I quote, "We do not think we need to match or outnumber the combined total of our adversaries to successfully deter them, but also that," continuing to quote here, "with a change in the trajectory that Russia and China are on, the United States will need to adjust our posture and capabilities." Now, some former officials and members of Congress argue the United States should begin preparations to increase the number of its deployed nuclear warheads and develop new nuclear capabilities, which would further add costs on top of the current nuclear weapons modernization program. And those costs are substantial. This year alone, within the Biden administration's budget request, there is an allocation of $69 billion for nuclear weapons operations, sustainment, and modernization, which is an increase of 22% over last year's. And that's spread across the DoD and NNSA. Congressional Budget Office calculates that spending on US strategic nuclear forces will total $756 billion over the next decade, beginning in 2023. And among what the Pentagon classifies as major defense acquisition programs, the nuclear component is now at least about a quarter. So earlier this year, the Pentagon acknowledged that the price of acquiring the new Sentinel ICBM, as Representative Garamendi mentioned, has risen by 37%, but that's not only where the costs are. The Savannah River plutonium facility, which is critical to the NNSA's hopes of producing 80 plutonium pits a year, now has a cost estimate of somewhere between $18 and $25 billion. And on top of this, Congress is funding a new weapon, the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, that the administration does not support. So to consider these issues, we are joined this morning by three distinguished panelists. First, on the end to my right, is Hans Kristensen, who is director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. We are also joined by Madelyn Creedon, who chaired the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Bill Hennigan, who is a national security, foreign policy, and conflict correspondent for the New York Times opinion section. We'll begin with opening remarks from our three panelists, and so I'll turn it over to Hans now to start us off.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the Arms Control Association for setting this up and the invitation to come and participate. Like you mentioned, I direct the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, and we've been sort of going at this for many, many years, building on, staying on the shoulders of other people before us in the non-classified world that tried to make sense of nuclear weapons developments. And so we're monitoring, to the extent we can in the open source, nuclear force developments in all of the 9 nuclear weapon states and try to sort of make sense of it. And at the outset, I'll say I think sort of numbers are a very poor measure for assessing what's necessary. The problem with numbers, of course, is that it's sort of a numerical game. It doesn't really tell you anything about what you need to be able to do what, but it's very easy to get caught up in, because especially if you're in a very tense international debate and discussion and climate, it's sort of tempting to respond in numerical ways to challenges. Now, we learned during the Cold War that that is a very problematic way of going about things. It can get you into trouble, and once you get on that treadmill of numbers and nuclear competition, it can be very hard to get off it again. What we see right now, and this is a trend that actually has been underway for, I would say, 7, 8 years or something like that, is that this era that we had come to know after the end of the Cold War about reductions in nuclear forces and also the reliance of nuclear weapons, that era is over, or certainly ending very rapidly. And what we're seeing now is that total inventories of nuclear weapons on the planet continue to decline, but that is only because the two largest nuclear armed states, the United States and Russia, continue to dismantle retired weapons that are no longer in the arsenal. If you just look at the portion that are the military arsenals, then those numbers are going up again. And they're mainly going up because dramatic developments in China, but also because other countries, including India, Pakistan, continue to increase, much less of a pace in their increase. We're also seeing it in the case of the Brits. I mean, they've announced that they need to increase the ceiling for their stockpile, presumably to entertain more warheads. So we're beginning to see that change. In that development, the United States has so far resisted the temptation to increase its stockpile. On the contrary, it's actually continued to decline over the years. And one of the reasons for that is that the US, during the period after the end of the Cold War, very deliberately tried to rely less on nuclear weapons in some of its military missions. And one, of course, very important right now, is this sort of regional scenario thinking, less reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. In fact, the military retired most tactical nuclear weapons unilaterally, didn't need it anymore. Not that regional scenarios and limited scenarios went away, but the military planning changed. And so they moved towards something where you could continue to reduce nuclear weapons, reliance on them. We deliberately had a strategy where we would rely more on conventional forces, especially in these limited regional scenarios. So it's resisted that, and in fact, built into the modernization program itself, nuclear modernization program, is the assumption of continued reduction. This goes both in the type of weapon systems, but also in the infrastructure. So that is one of these restraints that's now sort of knocking on our door. Does that put us in a position to be able to arms race with the Chinese and the Russians if that's the pace forward? United States and Russia have been very effectively constrained by the New START treaty, mainly because of its effects on launchers. There are obviously also limits on warheads that you can put on those launchers. But the ones you can't put on them are in storage and can, of course, potentially be put back on them. But the limits on the launchers have been very important. And this is still a limit that has effect both on US and Russian long-term planning at the strategic level. So it's very important that those limits don't completely fall away or the commitment to them fall away, even if the New START treaty falls away. So the US has largely a stable triad of nuclear forces, you could sort of say, with some moderate TAC-nuke inventory, a fraction of what it had during the Cold War. We estimate that the US stockpile is something around 3,700 now. There's uncertainty about it, but the Biden administration has for the last 3 years refused to declassify numbers about the stockpile. We're hoping that's going to happen this year, but we'll see what happens. But capabilities are evolving with the modernization of these forces, of course. So it's not like that number 20 years from now, 20 years back, sort of provide necessarily the same capability today. The forces today are better, more effective, more flexible. A lot of things have happened under this big number for these years. But by and large, the United States is poorly positioned to go into a nuclear arms race. primarily because of its nuclear infrastructure, its nuclear production capacity. It's trying to build more capacity into this production system, but that'll take quite some time. Russia also has a largely stable triad of nuclear forces. Yes, it's modernizing, it's been modernizing for many years, but it's staying within the confines, basically, of the New START Treaty. More important in the terms of the Russians, it's a large inventory of tactical nuclear weapons. It's a smaller inventory than they had a decade or two ago, but it's still significantly larger than the US. The US military used to not think that was very important. So what if they have 1,000 to 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons? We can do what we need to do. It doesn't change it. Now with the political debate about escalate to de-escalate and what have you, this idea about importance of limited or tactical nuclear weapons scenarios becoming more important again. And we can debate later whether it's a smart thing to go too deep into that or not. Russia is much better equipped for an arms race, an increase in nuclear production of warheads because of the way they have structured theirs over the years. China is obviously the most dramatic development right now because of its significant increase. This primarily an increase of ICBMs, where we are tracking something in the order of 350 ICBM silos under construction in various stages. And most of those are in 3 big areas that have been built in the northern part of China, central China. But we're also seeing sort of several dozen new silos that are being added to their traditional old liquid fuel silo areas in the southern eastern part of China. Their warhead number is, well, we think something just over 500 right now. That is a significant development, of course, since 2017, 18, 19, that period, where there was just sort of over 200. And apparently on their way to something in the order of 1,000 by the turn of the decade. We've heard rumors about perhaps 1,500 in 2035. There are a lot of constraints, uncertainties, and issues about how far they're going to go. We can talk about those later. But some of those that mostly influence that, of course, is their ability to produce enough plutonium for this many warheads, and how quickly to produce these. How many of the missiles in the silos will be equipped with how many warheads, et cetera, et cetera. So many uncertainties. And then we have sort of other arms control or arms developments, like in India, Pakistan. They have their, their sort of bilateral arms race, if you will, or our nuclear competition. It's been going on for many years. They've had several border wars, et cetera. There we see that India is now beginning in its modernization to move more of its focus to China. The point being that most of their efforts, the strongest effort, appears to be on systems that are intended to reach all of China. And they're now beginning to develop or test also the ability to produce or deploy multiple warheads on their longer range systems. So that's a new development somewhat for China. For India, it has been underway for some time. And then, of course, we have North Korea. Busy, busy, busy. Certainly want to show what they are trying to do, and uncertainty about exactly how much of their capacity is operationalized. Do they have operational warheads for their ICBMs? To what extent? What can they do? There are uncertainties there, but more emphasis on non-strategic tactical nuclear weapons most recently, both in their rhetoric and also development, and that raises some really thorny issues about potential earlier use of nuclear weapons in scenarios and previously considered. France, somewhat stable. It's doing what it's been doing. It's modernizing its 2 legs, and it continues to do that. They're not increasing or decreasing. The Brits have signaled an interest in increasing their stockpile limit for nuclear warheads from 225 up to 260. That is not the number, but that's the sort of the limit. Still very unclear what they mean by that, but it does seem, based on conversations we've had with British officials, that it's about having the ability to deploy more weapons on the missiles that they have been able to, a fuller load, so to speak, than they've been able to in the past. So I'll stop there with that quick overview. We can dive in as you see fit.
All right, thank you very much, Hans. Turn it over to Madelyn now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and thanks, Hans, for laying the foundation. I think that's super important. I was chairman of the Strategic Posture Commission, and these days this is what I do, is talk about the recommendations of the Strategic Posture Commission. But you know, one of the many conclusions that the Posture Commission came to was how different the world is from the last Strategic Posture Commission in 2009. And as was described by Hans in terms of numbers, we are on the cusp of having, the US is on the cusp of having not just one, but 2 nuclear pairs for the first time ever. And this is a situation that the US clearly didn't want. It's not prepared for, and it didn't plan for it. So the commission worked very hard to understand what really was going on. And when I say we, there were 12 of us. We were appointed by 8 members of Congress. This time we ended up with 6 men and 6 women, which also was quite different from the 2009 Congressional Posture Commission. And we organized our findings and our recommendations really by themes and what we thought were important in our 8 chapters. And so we started with a chapter on the stakes, which is our effort to explain why these geopolitical changes are important, why the US must remain engaged in the world, why isolationist tendencies are not in the long-term US interest, and why also our allies and partners are very important. And we also then included an entire chapter on allies and partners. We started our work by understanding the threat. In other words, understanding who is doing what. What is China doing? What is Russia doing? What is North Korea doing? What is Iran doing? And after many discussions with the intelligence communities, with various experts in think tanks, with various experts in academia, it was quite clear that all of these countries are on a very aggressive path to modernize not only their nuclear forces, but their conventional forces as well. That was a good foundation for us because it helped us understand what was really going on in the world as a commission. And we wrote a chapter on the threat in an unclassified way where, frankly, I think we pushed the envelope a little bit to try and get as much information into this chapter as possible, accessibly and in English. One of our findings and recommendations, actually there's several of them in this category, that have not gotten much attention is as we went through these various briefings with the intelligence community, we found a couple things. One, the intelligence community is very good when it comes to things. How many missiles, how many trucks, whatever. They're very good on things. What the intelligence community has lost over time, just because the world has been very focused on counterterrorism, violent extremist organizations, the Middle East, is the why is very difficult now. So one of our series of recommendations is that the intelligence community start to rebuild their capacity for understanding Russia, Chinese, North Korea, Iran, but particularly Russia and China, rebuild the capacity for understanding the why. And I hope they do this. This is important not only for us to understand the why, but it also helps with the long-term ability to avoid miscalculation. We want to make sure that there is good understanding of the why, so we don't interpret something to be this way when, in fact, the messaging is really on this sort of thing. We were the Strategic Posture Commission. I try to point that out routinely. We were not the Strategic Nuclear Commission. And most, obviously, of our findings are really focused on the long-term strategic posture of the US And so we put tremendous emphasis on making sure not only that our conventional capabilities are up to the task of deterring two peer adversaries, as well as the nuclear deterrent, which remains the ultimate backbone. But we also put a lot of attention on how do we pull in a whole of government. We noted that Russia and China are quite good at whole of government approaches, at messaging, at gray zone, and the US sort of struggles. Just an example would be maybe in the area of sanctions. We suggested that as the Defense Department does its planning, that the whole of government start to adapt those kinds of planning and scenario drills so that things like sanctions might be built into this planning initially. How do you use these tools of diplomacy? How do you use these financial tools to help shape the environment? This is extraordinarily important because it's clear that both Russia and China in the long term want to replace the US as the leader in the rules-based international order. And their goal is to replace the US and the West with something more conducive to their authoritarian regimes. We also made several recommendations for Congress. Having been a veteran of Hill staff for 20 years, I'm not holding my breath, frankly, that any of these will come to fruition, but I would certainly hope so. And part of this is really to forge and sustain bipartisan consensus and year-to-year funding stability to enable the defense industry to respond to innovative contracting approaches and to invest with more certainty, with more clarity, and with more cost effectiveness. We recommended that the Congress pass annual DoD and DOE authorization and appropriations bills on time with no continuing resolutions. The amount of increased costs that just that adds to various programs is really quite interesting. And finally, I know this will be somewhat controversial, but we also recommended that Congress avoid placing artificial caps on defense spending and that we really assess what's needed. The other thing that we talked about in great length is, again, in the realm of the importance of conventional capabilities and that we make sure that we have adequate conventional capabilities for deterrence. In our view, it was important to deter war to begin with, and a lot of that deterrence aspect is based on conventional capabilities, because we really do believe that if there is to be any military conflict, it probably is going to start in a regional context and will happen conventionally. So the whole goal is to deter any military conflict so that you then deter that conflict from moving to a nuclear dimension. Even the Biden administration and NPR recognized this without some additional increased conventional capability, that the US will have to rely more, not less, on nuclear weapons, which is certainly not consistent with long-term US goals. And finally, in our risk reduction section, we talked a lot, again, about the importance of diplomacy. We also recognize that right now, the situation for arms control, strategic stability talks, it's very bleak. I mean, Russia has pulled out or suspended of almost anything, although they are complying with the central limits of New START. We hope that continues to be the case. We hope that continues to be the case even after the expiration of the New START treaty. That said, I think it's important that the US begin to think about and plan what does a world look like with no strategic arms control treaties in place? What are the other creative things that might be done? We need to plan, we need to prepare for these things. A very specific recommendation that we made was really with respect to the work of the National Nuclear Security Administration. They have a quite extensive research and development program that covers a number of different things. Part of it is looking at sensor capabilities, how to understand what others are doing in the absence of the verification measures that were available under the New START treaty. In addition, NNSA has quite an extensive program to preserve those capabilities that will be necessary in the future when we hopefully, when we get back to something that looks more like traditional arms control, so that the U.S. is prepared to conduct negotiations, so the U.S. is prepared to have the verification tools, the inspection tools, to be able to actually do these treaties if they ever get back in place, because these things take time. And finally, I'll just close on the fact that we really are in a very new, very different, and very dangerous geopolitical situation where we noted the risk that China and Russia either opportunistically or even in collusion, although we didn't really see that, but opportunistically, the probability of two regional conflicts, either simultaneously or sequentially. And it's just a very dangerous world, and we have to really think about how to plan and live in that world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madelyn. Bill, it's all yours.
Well, first up, I'm just still basking in the glow that Daryl said it's a panel of experts, and so that I'm an expert, which is quite something considering I've spent the last several years calling all of you to tell me what actually is going on. My name is Bill Hennigan. I write under the byline WJ Hennigan, which is a ostentatious byline that I gave myself 20 years ago when I wanted to appear older than I actually was. And I am the lead writer on the New York Times opinion series, the project At the Brink, which I hope you've seen. Our goal with the series is pretty simple. We just want to inform our readers of the new nuclear age and the looming perils therein. We discuss the abandonment of the various arms treaties along with the rising tensions among the world powers that has unfortunately given way to the current volatile situation that we find ourselves in. We want our readers to be aware of this, form opinions so that the path ahead can be more democratic rather than left to the indoctrinated few. My personal aim is to explain this topic frankly and clearly to an audience who might not ever have engaged with nuclear issues or not for a long time. It's a tall task, as you all know, because this world, our world, is arcane and jargon-laden. Throw in the fact that people feel as though that they have enough problems in the world that they don't have to worry about thermonuclear exchange. It's not exactly a breezy read in your day. So the opinion desk is not a preaching to the choir here. We want to reach the uninitiated, people who follow the chaos in Ukraine and Israel and the confrontations with China, and we want to provide them with simple answers to complex questions and make them aware of the possible policy solutions to the mess that our generation finds itself in. Lucky for me, I work with a team with a team that has brilliant ideas and exquisite execution of design, graphics, video, and audio that make it easier for our readers to engage in a topic that they typically might not be interested in. And indeed, we've already had some impressive engagement and interaction with our audience about the project and look to build on that in the coming months. I've been fortunate to travel around the world to discuss these topics to places like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Seoul, Europe, and elsewhere to meet with people directly impacted by all this, average people. And I've crisscrossed our own country visiting segments of the nuclear industrial complex to deliver new insights on the revitalization that we've been talking about in the enterprise. For example, I was just out at Vandenberg Air Force Base, well now Space Force Base, where they recently launched 2 ICBMs over the last 3 days that you might have seen. And you know, I was talking to my friends about this. I bring this up only to talk about how average people, informed people, don't really know very much about the nuclear complex. And I was saying, you know, they were asking me about the trip to California, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go see a missile launch. Oh, a missile launch, okay. And then I said, yeah, and they're like, well, what happens? I told them, well, a missile emerges from out of the ground and it goes into space, and it goes 4,000 miles west to the Marshall Islands to hit a lagoon. They said, oh, that's crazy. How long does that take? 30 minutes. That's crazy. Then they're like, well, how does it launch? Well, you know, there's 2 missileers. They work in front of a computer that was, you know, built back in the 1980s. You know, like Oregon Trail computers. That's crazy. Yeah, and I like I say, I mean, I bring all of this up just to articulate that, you know, these are informed people with graduate degrees, yet they still don't know about this. There are 400 of these, as we all know, in the middle of the Great Plains states and farm fields, not on bases, in farm fields, which, as we all know, is also crazy. More than anything, I think I just want, you know, I think we should all be aware that we are handing our children a more volatile nuclear situation than the ones we inherited, and I don't think we should be okay with that. My own opinion is that we should reckon with the nuclear matters that remain unresolved, like the compensation for those exposed to the contamination by the weapons development, the fact that RICA expired today and was not expanded upon, despite the fact that many of us acknowledge the fact that people were poisoned by this and continue to face health struggles. You know, my job is to put these sort of issues in front of average people so that they can be motivated to lean on their policymakers to do what's common sense. I just feel like, you know, if more people were aware of these sorts of things, there would be more change. We've had this sort of complacency set in over the last 25 years, where people are not as motivated to lean on the policymakers to make this change. So, and I also, you know, of course, seek to bold ways to reverse the worrisome geopolitical situation that we're in. Because it's simply too important not to.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. So we're going to have questions now. I will provide the first round of questions, but if you have questions for the panel, please, as a reminder, please write it down on the notepads on your tables and pass it to ACA staff who will be around to collect them. So this first question goes to Hans. This is to do, you went over the numbers that that your team tracks. I'd like to know a little bit about both using just the open source information that you look at. What is our ability to understand what is happening with the Chinese buildup from outside? Where are the problems in that? How are those problems? How much better is the U.S. government at tracking these things, as far as we know? And second, if New START does expire in 2026, without a follow-on, if there is a political commitment to comply with the central limits going forward, what are some of the verification problems that would emerge from there that you would think about?
Great, thanks. Yeah, critical questions, obviously. On the first one about the ability to monitor what's going on. So, China is very interesting because they have sort of a policy of secrecy, and for many years have believed, it seems, that having such a secrecy policy or opacity about its nuclear capabilities would assist it in their deterrence capability, because adversaries would have to guess or wouldn't really know or couldn't take them out in a first strike or something like that. Those kind of ideas are way, way too simplistic, in my view. We can now go back and see declassified documents from the 80s, in which the U.S. intelligence community described in great details when they were building the silos deep inside the canyons and the mountains, and what did that consist of, and they were doing this and they were doing that, et cetera. So there was a lot of insight. But in those days, that insight was through the intelligence communities. What has really happened since is that much more of the insight about what's happening in China today is through open source information, and that includes commercial satellite imagery. You know, we're able to climb over the Chinese hills with satellite photos today and look at things in a way we were completely cut off just, 15 years ago. And ironically, the Chinese themselves, as they have become more used and interested to posture, if you will, also take a liking in showing some of what they have. So you will see themselves publishing exercise information, videos, things like that. Of course, it's very scripted and all these types of things, but you can read a lot into it. And one of the things we found we could read into it was like, well, there was a launcher here that was driving into a garage, and that garage looked like that, and there's a building over there and a hillside over there. Let's go on Google Earth. Oh, that's this base. We didn't know they had that launcher. And suddenly, you could do all these kind of things that the intelligence community used to be able to do. So there are difficult things with official secrecy, but there's also enormous new opportunities with open source. So that's a completely different world. And I also say that in a broader context, the United States has had nuclear arms control treaty with one country, Russia. Most of the nuclear arms states on the planet has no agreements with them about monitoring nuclear forces or limits or verification, and has been able to deal with that over the years. And so in reality, the only thing that will fall away with New START falling away, of course, is the strategic monitoring relationship with Russia. There is not a new situation with China in that sense. And here I think we are remarkably good at monitoring what's happening in China in terms of systems when they're coming up, how many, et cetera. It created some problems to secrecy when China started building these silos. Because of course we started hearing messages from the intelligence community saying, China's doubling, tripling, no, quadrupling their number of nuclear weapons. And in the public, we were like, really? What are the evidence of that? Where does that come from? But they couldn't talk about it. It was deeply classified information at that time. Then suddenly, 3 NGOs, or largely NGO units, including ourselves, started discovering these silos. And we did that by looking at patterns from other sites that enable us to discover these bigger sites. Suddenly it was out in the open. Suddenly officials could talk about it in a different way, and you could ask Chinese officials about it. They haven't been very quiet about particularly the silos, but nonetheless, it brings up a whole new dynamic in the discussion that you have access to this. So this is really, really important. The second one about the way forward if START falls away. Yes, it is a huge problem how structured arms control agreements have been falling away, and New START is now on life support. And the only real good thing, I would say, is that during those years of those arms controls, the United States and the Russians have actually developed a great appreciation for having some kind of agreement about where are we and where are we going. Yes, the credibility of the Russian leadership right now is in the toilet, but nonetheless, there's still an interest, a selfish interest in Russia for keeping limits on strategic forces, I think. We'll see where that goes, but I think both have an interest in it. I think neither the United States or Russia or China have any interest in sort of an unhinged arms race. For very selfish reasons. I'll stop there and we can turn it over.
All right, so it's a question for Madelyn regarding the commission report. As I was reading it, I thought you previously said that the conventional aspect of it has been a little bit neglected. What are some of the report doesn't consider budget numbers, doesn't consider necessarily the cost, but facing the cost now, what are some of the trade-offs that Congress and the administration are probably thinking about and should be thinking about as it considers all of the recommendations in there, because there's quite a few?
There are quite a few, and as you said, we didn't have the time, we didn't have the capability, and it wasn't within our remit to do the costing. So what we did, most of our recommendations are sort of what I would characterize more or less in the sort of homework assignments to this and future administrations, because this is a very forward-looking report. Our time horizon is really out to 2035. And so a lot of our recommendations are in the think about this, plan for this, do exercises, start to think about what does integrated deterrence really look like. What are these things that you're going to need, based on these trajectories. So it really was much more of a homework assignment than, do this, do that. In fact, we very specifically decided not to pick winners and losers. So, for instance, we did not get into the whole debate about the SLICM-N, the sea-launched cruise missile, the nuclear variant of that. And instead, we said, look, here are capabilities you should think about as you develop systems in the future. So we tried very hard not to make those sort of recommendations. We did, of course, support the program of record, which is really designed to comply with the New START Treaty. And said, look, we need to do this. We use the phrase necessary, but probably not sufficient. But we did not advocate for increases in the total stockpile numbers. What we said was, think about if you need to. Think about ways that if you need to deploy more, you can deploy more, but not increase the total stockpile numbers. We can't anyway, but we didn't see a need for that. I definitely want to agree with Hans that there is no, numbers are interesting, but they don't answer the question at all. They don't even come close. So when, people talk about, well, we need overmatch, or, we have to have the same numbers combined of everybody, it makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense.
All right, thank you. So as we go along, please, if you have comments on one of the other panelists' points, please just let me know. So Bill, first, of course, I'd like to know if you have any thoughts on the other panelists later, but for you, I'd like to hear a little bit about the reaction to the writing that you've done on these issues, and kind of hear what has the feedback been from other people in the newsroom and folks you've talked to. Now, you mentioned what you said about your friends, what you told them about the missile launch, but from other of your colleagues or from some of the readership?
Yeah. First of all, on the panelists, I met them before. I've known them, and they're pretty great people. The feedback. So, a lot of feedback has been from readers of a certain age who remember, the duck and cover drills, and they remember the day after, the TV film, and they see these worrying signs when you hear the implicit and explicit threats from Russia about nuclear use, and then the standoff with China and Taiwan. They're deeply concerned. But I also have heard from younger readers as well. There was speaking of the day after, there was a young high school student in Lawrence, Kansas, who reached out to me wanting to know more about nuclear weapons and the prospect of potential conflict, nuclear conflict, which, I was enthused because you can go on any college campus and see any number of climate change, environmental concerned groups, but you no longer see those freeze movement anti-nuke groups that we saw during the Cold War. So the fact that younger people are actually seeing this material and engaging on it is meaningful to me. As far as my colleagues are concerned, this is the first time a lot of them are engaging with this issue, and sometimes when I explain the sort of story or an issue, I'm met with basically the same sort of response that my friends have. Well, I had no idea that this existed. And it's insane that it does. So, so anyway, working through all of that is, again, we kind of have this echo chamber in the nuclear world where we talk to each other in these terms and this sort of thing. But I think that discounts really what I feel is most needed, which is an engaged citizenry to apply some brakes to the trajectory that we're on.
All right. So the first first question from the audience we have.
They may be a reader.
They may be a reader of ACT, yes, right, and also of yourself. Is for Hans and for Madelyn. This is about the Chinese buildup, actually. So what's your best explanation for the Chinese ICBM buildup? This is related, as you said, to the question of intentions, right? Mm-hmm. Hans, would you like to start?
Yeah, so, the analysis of that one is all over the map. It's sort of a combination of theory and conversations and obviously a bit of intelligence, but it's very hard to pin down. And it's probably not one. That would be, I think, the first big mistake, one reason. It's probably a combination of factors. First of all, the Chinese modernization is sort of the product of where it is at in its nuclear history. It has traditionally been at a very low level. Their leaders just didn't think that larger numbers were very important. And it didn't want to participate in an arms race, as it said. That has obviously changed to some extent. Numbers are now more important, but it's a little hard to figure out why they're important. Is it because they fear that the U.S. is much more capable at conducting a surprise first strike and take out their retaliatory capability? Is that it? Is it that they think that by having more nuclear forces, it gives them more leverage to deter others so they can do conventional things underneath and deter others from intervening? Or is it sort of just a, President Xi, he just likes that stuff and wants the Chinese military to be bigger. I mean, he has set out a decree that says, China has to be a world-class military power by the middle of this century, and he has told them to go do that. And so the services are like, whoa, lots of money, how do we do this? Well, US and Russia have a lot of silos, let's build a lot of silos. And, there's probably a lot of that dynamic in it as well. But I would sort of warn against being, focused on, the silver bullet answer to this stuff. It's most likely a combination of them all.
Yes, I agree. And then this is part of the conundrum about the U.S. and, why the Commission itself ventured far beyond the intelligence community to try and understand these questions. And it isn't just the nuclear buildup, it's a very large conventional buildup as well as doing some very interesting things that China hasn't really done in the past. And that's looking at how the U.S. system of alliances is quite important to the U.S. It's important to our allies and partners, and all of us together are stronger because of it. But you see China now venturing out, if not developing alliances in the sense that the U.S. has alliances, but certainly partnerships for maybe influence down the road. So with their road, their road initiatives. You see particularly on the maritime, if you just look at where they're investing in terms of these maritimes, they're going to ports all over the world, particularly in the global south. So they're doing things that certainly are pointing them in this direction of being a global leader, having the economic power, the military power to replace the U.S. As the leader of the rules-based international order and come up with an international order that's for themselves. But it's way more than nuclear. It's conventional, it's economic, it's diplomatic.
So related to this question is another audience member asks, at what point should the U.S. reevaluate China's minimum deterrence strategy? And what are some signals that the PRC has not only changed the way they view the threats they face, but also their doctrine? So I remember in the Commission report, the term used for describing China's doctrine was slightly unconventional. It was wasn't minimum deterrent strategy. I think it was a counterattack of some sort, but I don't remember exactly. But it was slightly different.
But I'll go find it. But I mean, the thing that we really were struggling with is, where is the end goal? China's conventional buildup is also pretty substantially. They have more ships in their navy than we do. Why? Is this a regional approach? Is this the global approach? And then how do we counter these things from a deterrence perspective so that we don't have conventional conflicts in a region? It's really quite unusual. We also put a lot of discussion, although there isn't too much in the report. We struggled a lot with, do you believe their no first use policy? They still have a stated no first use policy. Is it real? And I would say, some on the commission think it's completely invalid at this point. I mean, what they're doing is not consistent with that.
And the general in charge of U.S. Strategic Command, Anthony Cotton, he's said as much as that it no longer appears credible because of the immense buildup.
Can I piggyback on that one?
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, I don't think there is a minimum deterrent. Any country will say whatever it has is a minimum deterrent. We don't need any more. This is the absolute maximum we need, and we cannot go any lower. It's always the case. I think the thing about China, of course, is that they have articulated this, and their posture has reflected it for many decades. They really had a minimum deterrent in terms of ambition. The question is, do they believe in that even though they build more? And I would say that China can probably continue to claim publicly that it still believes it has a minimum deterrent. It's not going all the way up to the level of the United States and Russia, so they're modest. I mean, you could imagine, foreign affairs officials would massage that issue. I mean, they would love it. On no first issue, I think it's also interesting because my interest in no first issue is never about can you trust it in a war. Of course you can't. I mean, a country is going to do whatever it wants to do and it thinks it needs to do. The importance to me about no first use has been if it creates constraints on the nuclear posture of that country. Is it reflected in the plans and the force posture that we don't have a requirement that you need to be able to use nuclear weapons first? Therefore, a posture looks different. In that case, it has a benefit. But if deterrence fails and things start to fly, I don't think no first use matters at all.
All right, that's a good point. Bill, I'm going to go back to you quickly. So as you interviewed folks, some of them in this room, regarding your stories, what were some of the things you think maybe we don't appreciate enough as we engage, because we engage on these issues every day, that you realized as you were having these conversations? What were some of the things that you think that are underappreciated within the community that you might have seen?
Well, I mean, over time, the various conversations that I've had, I mean, the first thing was basically how close we've gotten to nuclear use, or at least in the eyes of the U.S. Intelligence services. I was told that there was a 50-50 chance that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine if they continued to succeed on the battlefield in the fall of 22. And I basically almost fell out of my chair when I heard that. Also, the fact of these sorts of the preparations that were made by the Biden administration, basically from the outset, in a nuclear contingency. I also feel like just kind of the underappreciated front. People want to know more about this subject. Polls show it. That average people say they don't know very much about nuclear weapons, but they want to know more. And I keep banging on this drum, but it's we have to meet them where they are, not where we the language that we speak, and it's in trying to do that in a compelling way. I feel like it's often said that people are that they don't care about these issues, and that dismissive. I think that's dismissive because I think people do want to know more. But they need help understanding it.
All right. So this is a question from the audience, and I'm going to link it to a question that I had originally, which is, this goes out to all of the panelists. Please feel free if you have an answer, which is, so the question from the audience, I'll give it first, is how does the Global South factor in our view of strategic competition? There are other issues that other states are more concerned about, food security, migration, and for the relationship between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, how will that relationship be affected if this nuclear competition is not constrained after 2026? Anybody want to take a stab? Big question.
Well, I mean, I can start by saying, obviously, China feels that the Global South is important in the great power competition. They've made numerous investments, including in space assets, satellites in the Global South. And this is concerning the United States behalf, certainly that that this influence is widening. As it pertains to the nuclear portfolio, I mean, the TPNW. There has been an effort to apply the sort of pressure. Unfortunately, the momentum that we saw just a few years ago has lost momentum in a way that is unfortunate. We don't see this effort kind of bearing fruit on the great powers. But hopefully there is a political space where that can be reversed.
So I would just say, one of the remaining things, obviously, is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, as it comes up to the next RevCom. I think it's important, really, to understand kind of where the P5 are going to be on this. China seems to be quite. This is an important treaty to China, so that's interesting. I don't know how they balance their commitments under the NPT and then also what they're doing, but nevertheless, it does seem to be important. The big, to me, the most problematic really is Russia, in the context even of the Outer Space Treaty, having vetoed, at least China abstained, but having vetoed the UN Security Resolution on placing nuclear weapons in space. These are the sorts of actions that really undermine, in reality, what they try and say. So yeah, I think it's a huge problem right now.
Yeah, that aspect of the NPT, I think, is also very important in the context of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, because this is the banned treaty internationally that was adopted a few years ago, and quite a number of countries have signed up to this treaty, but they're largely countries that are sort of out of the, nuclear/allied camp. Only countries that are outside that camp. Many of them are from the South, and so they're members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so, to what extent does that illustrate or reflect a frustration with the NPT and its longevity and what nuclear countries are doing there? Do we see more offsprings from that into these kind of regional protests, if you will, or initiatives? I also think another aspect that's interesting is how now that the nuclear powers or the large military powers are sort of posturing more in a direct strategic competition, how do the states, southern hemisphere states, so to speak, how do they react to that? How do they interact with that phenomenon? And here we see some interesting indications. For example, for the longest time, the Chinese have been deliberately trying to influence countries in the South to try to not support Taiwanese independence. More and more have sort of moved out of that category, saying, no, we no longer recognize that. In terms of Ukraine, we see how the sort of the Western, outrage about what Russia is doing in Ukraine hasn't quite been mirrored in what the people think, or the countries in the South think about it. They certainly don't react necessarily in the same way. They sort of been, yeah, okay, well, that's bad, but we still want to have some relations with the Russians. No, we don't want to sanction them. So there's a different pattern of reaction here that can have influence on how these regional scenarios and what to do about them play out.
Okay, turning to a specific escalatory concern one of our audience members had is regarding the SLICM-N, and also regarding U.S. Previously INF-barred missiles. So the question is, if SLICM-N is fielded, that opens the door to a GLICM-N, right? So which might be able to use the launchers that were recently deployed to the Philippines? Would the return of American ground-based INF forces open the door to a new INF treaty? Now, I know that some people have been making that case for a while. How would Russia and China react? And that's for any of the panel members that are interested or have thoughts on this question.
Well, you wrote a little bit about it in the posture.
We did. Obviously we had the not pick winners and losers, but we had capabilities. But you have to really think about this carefully. And I would start in thinking about it in the context of extended deterrence, because this is still very important, the U.S. Nuclear umbrella, having extended deterrence, not wanting countries that every once in a while talk about getting their own nuclear weapons. The ones that do, they're all members of the NPT, but they still talk about this sometimes. So, having capabilities that continue to reassure, and that isn't just nuclear, it's conventional too. And also making sure that we, the U.S., our allies, are really strong together. So, I simply note that recently there was the U.S., Japan, Korea trilat meeting where Secretary Austin made it very clear that the U.S. commitment to the defense of Japan and North Korea is ironclad. These are the sorts of things that I think are really important. So in the, this is a little bit off track, but in the Posture Commission, we also talked about making sure that the U.S. is sufficiently defended against coercive attacks from a conventional perspective, probably, and in terms of defending U.S. critical assets, so that a coercive attack against the U.S. for the purposes of coercing the U.S. to not come to the aid of its allies is also deterred. So there's a lot of what we did that's really focused on extended deterrence and making sure that others don't have this. With the GLICM-N, who knows if that's ever going to happen, but you have to put it somewhere, and putting it in the U.S. doesn't help. So, where would you actually put it, given the range of some of these systems? I know there's a lot of talk, but sometimes the ranges are just not practical. Particularly in Asia.
Hans, do you have a thought on this?
Well, I'm against it, it's really, I totally agree. It's very complicated to assess this, because in the public debate, when these things are thrown out there, it's not necessarily an expression of, we need this thing, otherwise we lose. It's quite often more symbolic than it's hardware. And so I think in the case of SLICM, first, that's the sea-launched cruise missile. First, think about, obviously, the cold strategy. What is the military requirement here? Are there target sets that this system can cover that we cannot cover with anything else we have? And that goes for both conventional and nuclear, of course. How does it fit into the strategy? What is it that we are trying to accomplish with nuclear weapons in regional scenarios? And what do they look like? Once you start doing them, what comes next? These kind of things are normally not analyzed in the public debate. And the other part, of course, is extended deterrence. That's mainly how this system is being sold right now by those who advocate for it, that somehow we have a gap, right? We need to have something in the regions in addition to what we already can provide that would somehow make a difference. You know, it would make an adversary say, we should not go and do this. And it would say our allies, you know, wow, now we feel safe, you know. So it's kind of like, how do you sell that, you know, there? And I just think people should ask really pointed questions when people throw these ideas out there, you know, what it is. The last part of that thinking is you have to think about this action-reaction pattern. And this is not a question about us being self-deterred by the Chinese and the Russians. It is a question about how do we want to try to shape the future development. When we do things, we want it to go in a certain direction that is hopefully more constructive than where it is now. And will that help in that process? And so I'm very doubtful that these things add up. And I think it's a sort of a, you know, chest-thumping kind of exercise, frankly speaking.
All right. Well, thank you, Hans. Some good points there. So that brings us to pretty much the end of the time we have for this panel today. Please join me now in thanking our first panel.